When J.D. Vance stepped onto the stage at a packed town hall in Columbus, Ohio, he expected tough questions. But he didn't expect a full-scale protest to erupt mid-speech. A group of angry activists stood up, ready to humiliate the senator, drowning him out with chants and accusations. What they didn't know was that J.D. wasn't there to shut them down. He was there to listen. And what happened next left the entire room stunned. Because instead of fighting back, J.D. Vance did something no politician ever does. He walked straight into the fire and turned a moment of chaos into an unforgettable lesson in leadership. The black SUV rolled to a slow stop outside the Columbus Civic Center, its tinted windows masking the tension inside. Outside, the crowd had already formed, a sea of signs, shifting bodies, and raised voices. Some were here in support, others, not so much. J.D. Vance exhaled, rolling his shoulders back. He had seen protests before, dealt with hecklers, faced down reporters fishing for missteps. But tonight felt different. The energy in the air wasn't just political, it was personal. His aide, a young man with a perpetually worried expression, peered through the glass. They've been out here for hours. Local organizers, union groups, some students from Ohio State University. He hesitated. It's not just noise, they're angry. J.D. nodded. He already knew. Stepping out of the car, the first thing he felt was the heat, not just from the late afternoon sun, but from the eyes locking onto him. "Liar!" a voice shouted. "Corporate puppet!" another added. Cameras clicked. Live streams rolled. Some supporters cheered in response, but the tension wasn't balanced. It leaned, heavy and uneasy, toward confrontation. He moved forward, his pace steady. A few feet ahead, security held the line, ensuring he could enter the building without an incident. Yet. Inside, the murmurs were already waiting for him. Rows of chairs lined the town hall space, most filled with working-class residents, small business owners, factory workers, retirees, many with arms crossed, brows furrowed. Some had come to listen, others had come to challenge. His team had tried to filter out the most vocal agitators, but a few had made it inside. He could see them, strategically placed, watching, waiting for their moment. A deep breath, a final straightening of his tie. Then he stepped onto the stage. The applause was scattered, respectful, but drowned out by the rising murmur of discontent. J.D. gripped the podium, scanned the crowd, and spoke his first words. And that's when the protest exploded. The first shout cut through the air like a gunshot. "You don't represent us." A second followed almost instantly. "You're a fraud." The words weren't random. They were coordinated. J.D. barely had time to register the shift before a group of people stood up in unison, banners unfurling above their heads. Bold block letters, "Stop lying to us." The room fractured. Some attendees turned toward the protesters, faces twisting in frustration. Others nodded, murmuring in approval. It wasn't a room anymore. It was a battlefield. Vance raised a hand, trying to keep control. "Folks," the chants swallowed his voice. "Empty promises, empty promises." His staff shifted uneasily near the stage entrance, exchanging glances with security. They were waiting for his call, waiting to shut this down. But J.D. didn't move. Instead, he leaned forward, gripping the podium tighter. His instinct told him to push back, to fight for control of the moment. But the noise was too much. A man in the second row, mid-50s, steel worker by the look of him, turned around and barked at the protesters, "Let the man speak." A younger woman near the aisle snapped back, "We've heard enough. We don't need more speeches. We need action." The tension thickened. Cameras caught everything. Every protester standing, every security guard shifting, every clenched jaw in the audience. J.D. scanned the faces in front of him, his mind working fast. He could wait this out. Let security escort them out, let his supporters boo them down. But then what? He exhaled sharply. Then, in a move no one expected, he stepped away from the podium and walked straight toward the protesters. The room fell silent. For a moment, everything froze. J.D. Vance stood inches away from the protesters, his eyes scanning their faces. Some were defiant, jaws set, shoulders squared. Others looked uncertain, like they hadn't expected him to step off that stage, hadn't expected him to walk straight toward them instead of hiding behind a podium. And then she stepped forward. Mid-20s, sharp eyes, posture rigid with purpose. She wasn't just another voice in the crowd, she was the one they followed. A reporter's mic dangled loosely in a nearby hand. In a swift move, she grabbed it. The audience gasped. Security tensed, ready to intervene. A few people in the crowd muttered, some amused, others outraged. She didn't care. Her voice, clear and unwavering, cut through the silence like a blade. Senator Vance, you talk about helping working people, but your policies don't reflect that. Prove us wrong, right now. J.D. held her gaze. The tension thickened, pressing against the walls of the venue. No one moved. No one dared to breathe. The weight of her words hung in the air, daring him to react. He had two choices. He could shut this down, wave to security, let them escort her and her people out. It would be easy. The crowd would cheer. His team would breathe a sigh of relief. He could control the moment, or he could engage. His instincts told him what every politician knew. Never, never hand the mic to a protester. Never let them dictate the conversation. But J.D. wasn't every politician. He exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back, and then he nodded. "All right," he said, "let's talk." A ripple of shock ran through the room, and just like that, the night had changed. The woman didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, closing the gap between them, gripping the mic like a weapon. She didn't care about formalities, didn't wait for permission. She was here to be heard. "Wages," she started, her voice sharp. "Factory closures, health care. You talk about the working class, but what have you actually done? Tell me, why should anyone here believe you?" J.D. didn't flinch. He didn't interrupt, didn't push back. He just listened. The protesters weren't used to that. No one was. They had expected him to cut her off, to dismiss her, to do what politicians always did, turn this into a polished soundbite before moving on. But J.D. stayed silent, his expression unreadable. She kept going. "My dad worked at the Stellantis plant, 30 years. Then one morning they tell him it's shutting down, just like that. No backup plan, no real severance. And where were you?" J.D.'s jaw tightened. Around the room, murmurs spread. Some nodded in agreement. Others crossed their arms, unimpressed. But the protesters weren't done. A young man next to her, late teens maybe, stepped in. "Healthcare's a joke," he spat. "My mom works 2 jobs and still can't afford insulin. You say you care about people like us, but what are you actually doing about it?" J.D. inhaled, slow and measured. And then he did something no one expected. He nodded. "You're right." A hush spread through the room. The protesters, caught off guard, exchanged quick glances. J.D. folded his arms, tilting his head slightly. "I get why you don't trust me," he said. "Hell, I'd be skeptical too. But let's get one thing straight. I didn't come here to dodge questions, so keep going. Tell me what's broken." It wasn't a defense, it wasn't deflection, it was an invitation. And just like that, the protest was no longer a protest. It was a conversation. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the steady hum of tension. J.D. Vance reached for the mic, not with the measured precision of a politician, but with the weight of a man who knew that one wrong move could turn this into a disaster. His pre-written speech? Gone. There was no script for this. He took a step forward, making direct eye contact with the woman leading the protest. "You have every right to be angry," he said, his voice steady. "Politicians have failed you before. Hell, I might even be one of them." A murmur rippled through the crowd. This wasn't what they expected. The protesters shifted, eyes narrowing, waiting for the pivot, the defense, the excuses. But J.D. wasn't here to dodge. He exhaled. "Look, I didn't come here to fight slogans with slogans. You don't trust me? Fine. Let's talk about real solutions, not just what's wrong, but what we do next." A pause. Then, the first crack. In the back row, a man lowered his arms, no longer crossed in skepticism. Near the front, an older woman nodded slightly, as if deciding to give him just 5 more seconds to convince her. But not everyone was buying it. A few scoffs, a few whispers. A younger protester near the aisle muttered, "Yeah, sure. We've heard that before." JD heard it too. He scanned the room, then took another step closer to the protesters. "No canned speeches, no talking points," he said. "Just tell me, what's the first thing you'd fix if you had the power?" The room shifted again. Some leaned in. Others remained skeptical. This was the turning point. Would the protesters double down on their anger or take the chance to engage? The protest leader wasn't satisfied. Her arms were still crossed, her expression locked in deep distrust. "All right," she said, gripping the mic tighter. "Let's talk about your record." JD nodded. He was ready. She wasn't here to make small talk. She raised her voice. "You voted against expanding healthcare access. You've sided with billionaires while calling yourself a working-class guy. You claim to be for the people, but who's actually benefiting from what you're doing?" JD didn't flinch. This was the moment most politicians would dodge. They'd change the subject. They'd shift the blame. He didn't. Instead, he leaned forward. "You're right to call out hypocrisy." That stopped her mid-breath. The crowd stilled. "But I'll ask you this," JD continued, voice unwavering. "How many of you have actually sat down with someone who thinks differently from you and really listened?" The words landed like a punch. A few protesters exchanged quick glances. The younger guy in the back, the one who had been the most vocal, looked away. The leader hesitated, but only for a second. "That's not the point," she shot back. "You're the one with power, not us." JD nodded again. "And what do you want me to do with it?" Silence. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because this wasn't going the way they expected. They wanted a fight. JD was giving them a conversation. Someone in the audience, not a protester, not a supporter, just a regular guy, spoke up. "She's got a point," he called out, "but so does he." The crowd shifted again. This wasn't protesters versus JD anymore. It was turning into something else. A politician wasn't supposed to do this. Not in a packed town hall, not with cameras rolling, not with protesters waiting for him to fail. But JD Vance wasn't moving toward the exit. He was moving toward them. The microphone in his hand clicked off. His staff froze, exchanging frantic glances. Security instinctively shifted forward, waiting for his signal. But JD didn't call for help. He didn't wave them in. Instead, he sat down, right there, on the floor. The room gasped. The protesters went silent. Phones snapped up, flashes firing. The audience murmured, whispering to one another. This wasn't a debate trick. It wasn't a rehearsed move. It was something different. JD rested his elbows on his knees, glanced up at the group standing over him, and gestured toward the floor. "Let's have the conversation you came here for," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But only if you're willing to have it, not just shout past each other. No slogans, no speeches, no defenses, just an open seat." The protesters hesitated. The woman leading the charge, the one who had thrown the hardest punches, stared at him. Her posture was rigid, untrusting. But behind her, others shifted on their feet. One of them, a young man, arms still crossed, glanced at his friend. Then, slowly, he sat down. Another followed, then another, until the entire group wasn't standing anymore. They were sitting with JD Vance. And now, the crowd wasn't just watching a protest. They were watching something rare, an actual conversation. At first it was awkward. The protesters sat stiffly, still skeptical. JD leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, scanning their faces. For a long moment, no one spoke, and then she broke the silence. "All right," the protest leader said, gripping the mic like it might disappear. "You want a real conversation? Let's talk." JD nodded. "I'm listening." And just like that, the script was gone. This wasn't a campaign speech. This wasn't a press conference. This was raw, unfiltered. She didn't hold back. "Working people are hurting," she said. "Wages aren't keeping up. Healthcare is broken. You talk about your roots, but what are you actually doing about it?" JD nodded slowly. He didn't interrupt. She wasn't finished. "You say you're different, but politicians always say that. What's stopping you from being just another guy in a suit making promises?" Her words hung in the air. The audience was silent. JD tapped his fingers against his knee, thought carefully. "And then?" he answered. "Nothing," he admitted. A ripple of shock spread through the room. JD glanced at the audience, then back at her. "Nothing stops me from becoming like them, unless you hold me accountable. Unless I hold myself accountable." The protesters exchanged glances. Some of them had never heard a politician admit that before. The younger guy next to her, the one who had been aggressive at the start, he leaned forward now. "So what are you going to do about it?" he asked. JD didn't dodge. He outlined real policies, things that weren't flashy but mattered. Infrastructure funding for shuttered factory towns, targeted tax cuts for small businesses, not corporations, expanding access to trade schools, not slogans, not platitudes, just plans. Some of the protesters listened, some argued back, and some stood up and walked out. Because not everyone wants a conversation, some want to fight. But for the first time that night, the room wasn't just divided, it was engaged, and that was the real shift. The moment JD Vance sat down on the floor, the world started watching. At first, it was just the people in the room, murmuring, whispering, pulling out their phones. But one journalist sitting near the back had already hit live. Within minutes, the stream was spreading like wildfire. By the time JD and the protesters were deep in actual conversation, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube were already exploding. Clips were being clipped, quotes were being shared, and hashtags were forming in real time. Vance versus protesters. Listen like JD, more than slogans. And of course, the critics had their own version. JD stunt, fake populist. Scripted BS cable news hosts were cutting into their scheduled programming. The right saw it as a strong leadership moment. The left debated whether it was authentic or calculated. But even the harshest critics couldn't ignore the reality of the footage. JD never shut it down. He never dodged. He never walked away. And that, in an age of political theater, was something people weren't used to seeing. One of the most replayed moments? The protest leaders staring at JD, eyes narrowed before saying, "I still don't trust you." And JD responding without missing a beat, "Then keep watching me." That line alone, 10 million views by morning. Days later, the town hall was still making headlines. Pundits, strategists, and political analysts were dissecting every second. Some called it a masterclass in damage control. Others called it genuine leadership. But no one could call it forgettable. JD broke his silence with a tweet. "Disagreement is healthy. Engagement is necessary. Last night wasn't about winning, it was about listening. Let's have more of that." Within hours, it had hundreds of thousands of likes and shares. Then, something unexpected happened. The protest leader, the woman who had challenged him the hardest, posted her own response. "I still don't agree with JD Vance on everything, but he listened. That's more than most politicians do." The internet exploded again, because that was bigger than a headline. That was change. In the weeks that followed, other politicians were pressed to follow suit. Town halls felt different. Protesters weren't automatically dismissed. People wondered, if JD Vance could sit down and engage, why couldn't everyone else? And for JD himself, this wasn't just a moment, it was a shift. Because the event that was supposed to humiliate him, the night that was meant to derail him, had become something else entirely. It had become proof. Proof that, in an era of scripted politics, sometimes the unscripted moments are the ones that matter most. Want to hear more of this? Then click on the video on the right-hand side, which is even more insane.